Every story we tell is a journey, a thrilling adventure that will keep you hooked from start to finish. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing our community come together from all around the world. And don't forget, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Tomorrow, we have a special story just for you. Trust us, you won't want to miss it. See you on the next adventure. She did something insane to a royal guard. Now she regrets everything. London was alive with its usual energy. The mid-morning sun bathed the historic streets in a warm glow as double-decker buses rumbled past, their bright red paint reflecting the light. Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd had gathered, just like every other day. Tourists from around the world chattered excitedly, cameras poised to capture every moment. Some were eagerly awaiting the changing of the guard, others were snapping selfies against the backdrop of the grand gates, and a few simply marveled at the motionless royal guardsmen standing in their signature red tunics and towering black bearskin hats. But among the sea of excited faces and waving smartphones, one figure stood out, Rebecca Lane. At 41 years old, Rebecca didn't fit the usual tourist profile. She wasn't snapping photos. She wasn't listening to a guide. She wasn't admiring the grandeur of the palace. Instead, she stood rigidly still, a small notebook clutched tightly in her hands. Dressed in a long green trench coat despite the 75-degree weather, she looked strangely out of place. Her wide-brimmed hat sat awkwardly atop her head, slightly tilted, with messy blonde hair peeking out from underneath. Unlike the others, Rebecca didn't seem amused or impressed. Her sharp, piercing gaze wasn't fixed on the palace, nor on the crowd. It was locked onto one specific royal guard standing near the barrier. Her eyes never wavered, studying him with an unsettling intensity. Every few moments, she would scribble something down in her notebook, her handwriting small and frantic, as if recording something urgent. Her lips moved silently, whispering something to herself, words no one could hear. A few nearby tourists noticed her odd behavior. "What's she doing?" a young woman murmured, gripping her companion's arm. "Maybe she's checking if they're real," a man chuckled, though there was uncertainty in his voice. Rebecca, oblivious to the whispers, took a slow step forward. Her expression grew more focused, more obsessive, as she lowered her gaze, this time, not to the guardsman's face, but to his boots. Something about them seemed to fascinate her, almost hypnotize her. She froze, tilting her head slightly, her lips still moving in silent calculations. Then, in a way that sent a ripple of unease through the crowd, she began to bend forward, inching closer. The tourists' murmurs grew louder. Something wasn't right. Rebecca Lane's behavior had already drawn whispers from the crowd, but now, it was impossible to ignore. She had inched even closer to the barrier, her eyes locked onto Lieutenant James Carlisle's boots like they held some kind of secret only she could understand. The 6 feet 3 inches royal guard remained completely still, his impeccably tailored red tunic crisp, gold buttons gleaming in the sunlight. His tall bearskin hat cast a shadow over his chiseled features, but even without seeing his eyes, it was clear, he had noticed her. He was trained to be aware of his surroundings, to sense disturbances before they escalated. And right now, every instinct in him was telling him that this woman was different, Rebecca's fingers gripped her notebook tightly, her knuckles white. Her lips moved faster now, her whispered words turning frantic. Then, as if pulled by an unseen force, she suddenly dropped to her knees. The crowd gasped in confusion. "Is she okay?" someone muttered. "Maybe she dropped something," another voice suggested. But Rebecca hadn't dropped anything. She wasn't searching for a lost item. She was simply staring. Her head tilted to the side as she studied the leather of James's boots, her eyes darting over every detail. She seemed to be muttering numbers under her breath, as if calculating something. Then, she reached out. A few people took a step back, unsure of what they were witnessing. Tourists lifted their phones, some recording, others frozen in place. Rebecca's fingers trembled just above the polished surface of the guard's boot. James didn't flinch. But inside, he was on high alert. This was unlike anything he had encountered in his 5 years of service. He had dealt with obnoxious tourists, pranksters, even the occasional drunkard trying to make him react. But this was something else entirely. Then, Rebecca did something that made the hair on the back of people's necks stand up. She slowly leaned in, lowering her head mere inches from the guard's boot, her breathing becoming uneven, almost shaky. A security officer, now aware of the growing tension, took a step forward, his voice firm. "Ma'am, step back." Rebecca didn't move. Instead, she did something that sent a wave of unease rippling through the crowd. She smiled. But it wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too unnatural, as if she were on the verge of discovering something that no one else could understand. And that's when everything changed. The atmosphere around Buckingham Palace had shifted from curious to unnerving. Tourists who had been casually filming the changing of the guard were now laser-focused on the woman in the green trench coat, crouched before Lieutenant James Carlyle. Rebecca Lane's unnatural smile had not faded. If anything, it had only grown wider. Her breathing had become shallow and erratic, her fingers twitching as if she were fighting the urge to do something she knew she shouldn't. The security officer, now fully aware that this was no ordinary tourist, took another step forward. His voice was firm, commanding, no longer a request but an order. "Ma'am, step back. Now." The words barely left his lips when Rebecca acted. In one sudden, unnatural movement, she lunged forward. Gasps ripped through the crowd as she clamped her teeth onto the leather of James's boot. A sickening, wet squelch echoed through the square. For a split second, there was complete silence, as if time itself had frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the usual city noise, the distant hum of traffic, the chatter of tourists, seemed to vanish. Then, the screams began. "Oh my God!" a woman shrieked, clutching her chest. "She bit him! She bit him!" a man exclaimed, stumbling backward. Phone shot higher into the air. The entire moment was being recorded, countless lenses capturing the insanity unfolding in real time. Yet, in the middle of the chaos, Lieutenant James Carlyle didn't move. not even an inch. The pressure of her teeth against the thick leather registered in his mind, but he did not react. He did not flinch. He did not acknowledge the absolute madness of what was happening. But Rebecca didn't let go. Her jaw clenched tighter, her fingers dug into his pant leg, her breathing was ragged, almost animalistic. It was as if she was trying to prove something, as if this moment meant everything to her. And then, as if the situation couldn't get any worse, she started laughing. A low, trembling giggle at first, but then it grew, louder, sharper, unhinged. The security officer snapped into action. "Get her off him!" Suddenly, multiple guards rushed forward, the spell of frozen horror shattering as two Royal Guard officers grabbed Rebecca by the arms, yanking her away. But she fought. She thrashed violently, her eyes wide with a disturbing mix of triumph and desperation. Her feet scraped against the pavement, her green coat flaring behind her as she screamed at the top of her lungs. "He's real! I had to check. He's real!" And in that moment, as the crowd stood frozen in disbelief, it became clear. This was no ordinary act of insanity. This was something much, much stranger. The square outside Buckingham Palace had transformed from a peaceful tourist attraction into a scene of pure chaos. Rebecca Lane, still thrashing against the grip of the Royal Guard officers, was no longer a mere tourist, she was a spectacle, a disturbance, an obsession given form. Her green coat whipped around her as she struggled, her eyes wild with an unsettling mix of triumph and delirium. "He's real," she screamed again, her voice cracking as she kicked at the ground, trying to break free. "I had to know. I had to check." The guards restraining her gritted their teeth, their grips tightening. "Control her," barked one of the officers, his tone sharp, demanding immediate action. Meanwhile, Lieutenant James Carlyle stood firm. Not a single muscle in his 6 feet 3 inches frame had moved since the moment Rebecca bit down on his boot. His posture remained flawless, his face an unreadable mask of discipline. Even with the madness unfolding inches away, he did not react, a living symbol of unshaken duty and honor. But the crowd? The crowd was in full-blown hysteria. People were backing away, whispering in confusion. Some were covering their mouths in horror, others were still filming, their hands trembling as they recorded. A woman in sunglasses was visibly shaking, her phone clutched so tightly it looked like it might snap in half. "This is insane," someone muttered. "Is she on drugs?" another voice asked. "No, she's not crazy, she's obsessed." The sound of approaching sirens cut through the air. London's Metropolitan Police were closing in fast. Within seconds, 2 officers in dark uniforms stormed through the crowd, their expressions cold and unreadable. "Step back," one of them commanded, dispersing the nearest onlookers. The other rushed toward Rebecca, who was still jerking violently against the Royal Guards restraining her. The police wasted no time. One officer grabbed her by the shoulder, the other snapped a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Enough." The metallic click of the cuffs locking around her wrists was like the final note of a crashing symphony. Rebecca let out one last blood-curdling scream, half laughter, half raw emotion, before her body finally went limp. The crowd exhaled as if they had been holding their breath the entire time. One of the officers pulled Rebecca upright, speaking with measured authority. "You are under arrest for assaulting a member of the Royal Guard and disturbing public order." But Rebecca? She wasn't listening. Her head lolled to the side, her breathing uneven, but on her lips, that eerie smile remained. And as they dragged her toward the waiting police car, she whispered one last thing. "I told you, he's real." Even after she was gone, her words hung in the air, unsettling, unanswered. The world had seen insane tourists before, but nothing like this. And as Lieutenant James Carlyle stood motionless, his boots still stained with the saliva of a madwoman, the crowd couldn't help but wonder. What had she been trying to prove? The moment Rebecca Lane was shoved into the back of the police car, a strange silence fell over the square. The crowd that had been roaring just moments ago now stood frozen, staring at the empty space where she had just been. Only one person had not moved an inch, Lieutenant James Carlyle. His rigid stance remained unshaken, his chiseled features unreadable beneath the towering bearskin hat. But there was one thing that no one could ignore: his boot, still stained with the saliva of the woman who had just bitten into it like a starving animal. And then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the moment exploded onto the internet. Within hours, social media was flooded with videos of the incident. TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube became a battlefield of theories, jokes, and debates. The footage was everywhere, appearing in news reports, reaction videos, and even late-night talk shows. Did she seriously bite a royal guard? What the hell was she trying to prove? Is this some kind of experiment? Or is she just crazy? Some mocked her, turning the moment into memes. Screenshots of her lunging at the guard appeared with captions like "British guards are not on the menu" and "When you take standing your ground to a new level." But others weren't laughing. Conspiracy theories started circulating, people dissecting every frame of the footage, analyzing Rebecca's whispered words, her frantic notes, her final haunting phrase. "I told you, he's real." Some even slowed down the video, trying to understand what she had seen. Look at her eyes. She wasn't insane. She was searching for something. She kept repeating numbers. Was she calculating something? What if she knew something? Meanwhile, Rebecca Lane sat in a cold, windowless holding cell, silent. She hadn't asked for a lawyer. She hadn't spoken since her arrest. She just stared at the wall, her fingers twitching slightly, as if still writing in that notebook that was now locked away as evidence. When her case went to trial, the judge's voice was calm but stern. "You are charged with assaulting a member of the Royal Guard and disturbing public order." Rebecca finally lifted her head. For the first time since her arrest, she spoke. Her voice was soft, emotionless. "I just needed to make sure they were real." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The judge sighed, rubbing his temple, before sentencing her to 6 months of community service. The verdict made headlines, but the real conversation was happening online. Theories, jokes, debates, everyone had something to say. And yet, through all the chaos, one man did not acknowledge the madness at all. Lieutenant James Carlyle remained at his post outside Buckingham Palace, standing as he always had, silent, unshaken, undisturbed. But now, when tourists approached the royal guards, they no longer mocked them. They no longer pulled faces or tested their patience. Instead, they kept their distance. They watched more carefully. Because now, they weren't just looking at guards. They were looking at something else entirely. And no one could forget what they had seen. What do you think about this insane incident? Was Rebecca just an unhinged tourist, or was there something more behind her obsession? Drop a comment below. Do you think she deserved her punishment, or was she just misunderstood? Have you ever witnessed something shocking while traveling? Share your craziest tourist stories. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more unbelievable stories like this.